We're live.
Like on TV. We are.
Hi there, I'm Joel Furches from the Mentionables, and today I'm going to be doing a video response to this.
This is the argument from consciousness debunked.
Now let's set up the premise here. The ability to interact with the environment rationally doesn't have to involve consciousness. A Roomba could do that. But if we're to assume that the universe is rational in some kind of real, ontological way, it has to be the product of a rational mind. Much like you can't read a book that wasn't written by some kind of rational mind, you can't comprehend a universe that isn't comprehensible. Einstein himself said that the most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, that our rational minds can grasp, analyze, and understand the world around us, not just respond to it. So this is how the argument from rationality works. Essentially, we would not be able to trust any of our thoughts or conclusions about the world around us if our thoughts and conclusions were the product of chemical reactions and not grounded in abstract reasoning. Now, notice I said the argument from rationality. The argument from consciousness has to be tied into the argument from rationality, because to simply have the capacity for directed movement and a responsiveness to one's environment isn't what you and I mean by consciousness. What you and I mean is a sort of self-consciousness, like metacognition, where you're aware of your own thoughts and able to actually think about thinking. We're not just talking about observable behavior that interacts with a physical environment, but what you might call inner behavior, or verbal behavior wherein you're talking to a self, an identity that only you possess. Let's see what he says.
Arguments from consciousness that assert that neither naturalism or materialism can provide an adequate explanation of consciousness, but that theism can. So, to present this argument in its syllogistic form, it is a fact that human consciousness exists. This fact can be adequately explained within a theistic framework, i.e., one which posits God's existence, whereas it cannot be adequately explained within a naturalistic or materialistic framework, i.e., one which lacks a belief in God's existence. Hence, there is a fact that only theism can adequately explain. Therefore, God exists.
I'd like to tweak a few things here. Firstly, the difficulty with explaining human consciousness is that it exists in the abstract. So, try to explain consciousness. It isn't easy, because it's something we know through experiencing it. It's not something you could explain absent the experience. So the difficulty here is to explain the abstract. Abstractions don't just stop with consciousness. Things like reason, logic, math, language, and beauty are also abstractions. So the explanatory nature of theism is that the universe is a result of pure mind. That there exists, at bottom, pure consciousness that grounds abstractions which can only exist in a mind. So logic, rationality, beauty, and math can be said to exist because they exist in the ultimate mind that grounds them. That mind being God. Now he says that naturalism or materialism are the lack of belief in God. That's not exactly right. Atheism is the lack of belief in God. Naturalism and materialism are the idea that the only things which exist are matter and energy, and the forces that combine them. So, if he's going to defend his premise for the framework of naturalism, he's going to have to explain consciousness in terms of matter and energy, not in the abstract.
To take on this argument, it's critical that we first define what consciousness means, and preferably within 10 hours. But jokes aside, its basic definition is the state of being aware of and responsive to one's surroundings, which is indeed what most of us mean when we say consciousness. But the reason this needs to be nailed down immediately is because many proponents of the argument from consciousness attempt to implicitly define it to mean something that it's not, such as a transcendent part of the human personality. And in doing this, they're attempting to smuggle immaterial and unnatural properties into the definition of consciousness, which is essentially a backhand way of begging the question.
Earlier said that consciousness is hard to define unless you've experienced it. Now, to say that the state of being aware and responsive to an environment sounds pretty simple. It sounds like something an amoeba could do. Except for the aware of part. See, an amoeba can respond to its environment. So can a plant. But responding to an environment doesn't make one aware of the environment. Awareness itself is a hard term to nail down. In fact, the dictionary defines awareness as the state of being conscious of something. So what is consciousness? It's awareness. But what is awareness? It's consciousness. When you have two words that rely on one another for their meaning, you've encountered a concept that's difficult to define outside of direct experience. Now let's talk about the theistic definition. Notice that when I talked about consciousness, I did not use the term transcendent. I used the term abstract. We can argue over whether or not there is a transcendent realm, but we can more or less agree that there are abstract ideas. Things like imagination, ethics, and personal fulfillment. You can't take a tape measure or a thermometer to those things. They can be measured by their effects on human behavior. So let's say I'm imagining a blue dog with wings and a great big clown nose. No such animal exists in real life, and you had no access to my imagination. But I used words to describe the blue flying dog with the clown nose, and now you are imagining it because my words triggered the image. Does my imaginary experience match yours? We could never know. And yet, through a series of sounds, my words, I've transferred an image in my mind into yours. But we could explain this somewhat. However, if you sit and observe the sunrise over the ocean, reflecting in the waves, we might both agree that the sight is beautiful. But what does that mean? A flying dog is described in physical terms, but beauty is an abstract experience that we can both somehow share without having access to each other's experience.
Consciousness is a product of the mind, which in turn is a product of the brain. There's absolutely no evidence to suggest that our consciousness is independent of our bodies. None. With that said, let's get on with it. Let's debunk the argument from consciousness.
So here he says that consciousness is the result of a mind, and the mind is the result of a brain. So in his view, consciousness is sort of a byproduct of the brain's chemical operations, nothing more. But to embrace this conclusion is to sacrifice quite a bit. Firstly, if consciousness is the product of purely physical processes, this undermines every experience we have. For instance, there is no me. Why do I say that? Because my brain is in a constant state of change. Moreover, it isn't even close to the same brain I had when I was a child. So my idea that I have an identity that persists over time is an illusion. Of course, illusion itself is a mere brain state. Further, we can't trust any conclusions we come to, because there is no part of our personality that extends beyond our brain, and our brain is simply a responsive organism in a universe of nothing beyond matter and energy. Now, I am not myself saying that the brain could never produce consciousness. I am, however, saying that consciousness is not the same thing as the brain. My computer monitor produces images, but images are not the same thing as a computer monitor. They are the product produced by the monitor, and my brain can make sense of those images. The impression left from those images in my brain will persist over time, long after the monitor stops working. This video is nothing but light and sound, but your brain is able to make meaning out of those things. And even if your brain is a mere engine for producing consciousness, meaning is something outside of your brain that your brain can still apprehend. See, the argument from consciousness isn't simply about how it is that we are able to respond to our environment. Rather, it is the nature of the response. We know we are conscious because we can make sense of and apprehend meaning in our world. So, even if we were just walking pieces of meat, the things we can perceive beyond our physical environment, meaning, reason, and purpose, are real. And then abstracts exist. This is why a human is a different kind of thing from an insect. Whereas an insect is only able to perceive its physical environment, humans can perceive things outside of the physical environment. A bug can respond appropriately to a leaf, but only a human can respond to a poem.
In my opinion, the first objection to be stated is that premise 3 doesn't follow from premise 2, making the entire argument a non sequitur. Even if we were to assume that theism can adequately explain consciousness, and that naturalism can't, it by no means follows from this alone that only theism can explain consciousness. To name a few alternatives, deism and pantheism can both explain consciousness within their frameworks, and so right from the outset the argument from consciousness isn't coherent. Its conclusion doesn't follow from its premises even if they were all valid, which so far as arguments go, is pretty damn pathetic.
I'm going to agree to some extent with him here, although not so much with deism. There are some alternatives to pure monotheism that explain consciousness. Pantheism proposes a concept called panpsychism. Panpsychism proposes that consciousness is a sort of universal trait that our brain receives from the universe. But because it is the universe which produces consciousness, we all essentially share the same mind. It also says that inhuman things like plants, planets, and stars are also conscious and aware to some degree. I don't think that deism is a particularly compelling explanation for consciousness, because deism makes a sort of hyper-separation between reality and God. Consciousness would have to be grounded in an involved, personal, and active mind. This is why pantheism is more plausible than deism, because pantheism makes consciousness an inherent trait of the universe. My favorite alternative, though, would be Platonism, which proposes a realm of abstracts, all of which form the template and source upon which physical reality is based. To omit any kind of abstract realm would be to explain things I've been talking about. But I think a personal and absolute mind serves as the most parsimonious proposition.
The fact that the argument from consciousness posits only naturalism and theism as valid options, without justifying why these two options are the only available, means that it commits a black and white fallacy.
If the argument from consciousness were used in its stated form, without any sort of fleshing out, beyond the syllogism that he suggests, then I would agree. Notice I agree with him that there are alternative explanations, all of which are better than naturalism. So, how do I go from positing that consciousness exists as a kind of bridge between the physical and the abstract to the conclusion that there is a sort of universal personal mind? Well, firstly, to be conscious is to be personal. It's not my hands or my eyeballs that make me a person. It's my personality, my method of communication, my character, my way of thinking and responding. These are the things which make me a person whom you can get to know and have a relationship with. To have a mind is to be personal. And so God is our best suspect. A deistic God is by nature uninvolved and impersonal. He stands sulking outside the universe and doesn't interact with it. The monotheistic God is omnipresent, aware of everything at all times, and personal. He is absolute mind. What about pantheism? Well, if there is only one mind, and we are all receiving a bit of access to that mind, it's about as impersonal as it can get, because there are no persons. At best, there is person. A Platonic realm relies on the notion that at the heart of all things is an ontological foundation, which Plato called the good. For Plato, the good was a sort of absolute source of great making properties, of which consciousness was one. So there's very little difference between Plato's good and the monotheistic God.
Even if the conclusion of the argument was valid, all it would prove is that theism alone can explain consciousness. It wouldn't even suggest, let alone prove, that a specific religion is true. And as Christopher Hitchens once said, even if you've established deism, you've still got all of your work ahead of you to be a theist. Hence, even if it was valid, the argument from consciousness doesn't remotely support a specific theistic religion.
So I'm going to agree with him somewhat. I've argued against deism already, but does the argument for consciousness prove a specific religion? Well, it certainly narrows down the options. We're left with a religion that has a single, personal God who is the greatest potential mind. We've ruled out pantheism, deism, and polytheism. Monotheism is our best suspect at this point. Of course, there are monotheistic religions outside of Christianity, but not many.
A fourth spectacular flaw that the argument from consciousness commits is a giant argument from ignorance. If we cut to the core of what's being asserted, it's essentially that because we can't explain consciousness from a naturalistic framework, which, by the way, we can, theism must be correct. Or put more directly, the argument from consciousness is founded on the statement that we don't know how to explain consciousness, therefore God.
A few things that could be said here. I would agree with him that the argument from consciousness is not, on its own, sufficient evidence for God. But it sits among a much larger body of evidence which, taken together, supports the conclusion of God. Whenever the God of the gaps accusation is dragged out, it comes along with a similar fallacy. Naturalism of the gaps. Now what do I mean? I mean that if God serves as one potential explanation for something like consciousness, design, the origin of time, space, and life, he is dismissed by the hand-waving, it couldn't be God, therefore it has to be something natural. It's this faith that science absolutely will find a natural explanation for these things someday, even though now it has no idea. There is one way in which I think God of the gaps is a reasonable criticism, and that is those instances in which the kinds of things we are observing are the sort of thing that are consistent with a universe of matter, energy, and force. We don't know how planets and stars moved, or we didn't, but we knew that objects were attracted to one another and that motion was a natural part of the universe. And so it was reasonable to propose a natural solution. God is only a reasonable explanation for a thing if and only if the thing being explained is not consistent with the natural forces of which we are aware. For instance, I think that the origin of living matter, while extremely improbable, might end up having some kind of natural explanation, because the sorts of chemicals and processes that animate matter into life are consistent with natural things like chemistry and physics. The presence of design in the universe, while highly improbable, might have some sort of natural explanation. The origin of everything from nothing has one foot planted firmly in metaphysics, and so God serves as just as reasonable an explanation as the sorts of physics that can't exist outside of matter and energy. But the presence of consciousness, rationality, logic, and meaning are so highly abstract and metaphysical that God becomes a much more likely suspect in those cases. I don't happen to believe that any individual argument for God's existence is a slam dunk, but I think there is a body of arguments that, taken together, make the existence of God all but inevitable, among which consciousness sits.
A fifth law, and to get back to the erroneous assertion that naturalism can't explain consciousness, is that it can. It's called natural selection. At the risk of boring you through repetition, natural selection is the process whereby organisms that are better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. To state it very, very simply, the nervous system evolved to orchestrate movement. Feelings evolved to move organisms towards or away from stimulus. Awareness evolved to make sense of these feelings, and consciousness evolved to allow organisms to respond more efficiently to their feelings.
This tends to fall apart when he says that awareness evolved to make sense of those feelings. It's a pretty fantastic assertion, and I don't see how it follows. I think that here he's tangling together independent concepts like reason, rationality, and intelligence, all under the umbrella of consciousness. Intelligence has a high degree of survival value. One would think that nature would tend to select towards intelligence. By intelligence, I mean the ability to rapidly adapt and modify behavior in order to accomplish ends towards which one's feelings direct one. For instance, the use of tools in primates as a way of getting food demonstrates intelligence. It also demonstrates awareness insofar as they are responsive to their environment and use their sensory perceptions in order to act in ways that best meet their physical needs. Natural selection has a great deal going for it. It gets us to the point that we have sensory organs, which is important since we, as organisms, need to avoid and harm and seek out the stuff that keeps us alive and reproducing, like food, shelter, and potential mates. At some point between learning to plant gardens to harvest food and planting gardens for their beauty, we have leapt beyond mere adaptation into the realm of abstraction. In fact, this whole desire to argue about God's existence, to display passion in doing so, and to deeply desire to win the argument, demonstrates a commitment to abstracts and metaphysics that would be better explained in terms of abstractions than in terms of material laws and forces.